television, you're not far off. You see, Christopher is a 6-time award-winning host and executive producer of the American Law Journal. This is a weekly talk feature television program airing from Philadelphia for the past 25 years, and to our good fortune, is going to be airing on PBS this year. So be sure and put that on your to-watch list. 40 years ago, Christopher Naughton discovered the Edgar Cayce readings. Shortly after that, he began taking a Search for God study group and became a life member. At that time, he was a student at Pat Robertson's CBN University School of Communication for Broadcast Journalism right here in Virginia Beach. His New World radio show has aired here on the local NPR affiliate, as well as on Unity Online Radio. Christopher's recent Venture Inward article on founding mystics and his forthcoming book, America's Next Great Awakening, examine the metaphysical and mystical roots of our nation. Christopher is going to be joined a little later on by a special panel of guest speakers, some of whom you've already heard. Mitch Horowitz, who spoke with us on Sunday night, and he'll be again speaking tomorrow afternoon. Dr. Kathy Callahan, who spoke earlier this afternoon, and Brian C. Wilson, whose wonderful book about the New Age philanthropist John Fetzer you should have already received. And if you haven't received that book, please see our wonderful staff in the lobby and pick yourself up one. Now, to enlighten us a little bit more about Edgar Cayce and the soul of America, please give a warm welcome to Christopher Naughton.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Well, first, a couple of thank yous. I want to thank Kevin Tedeschi and Allison for making this possible. I also want to thank the man in the booth. You don't see him much. Kevin Grant makes things run very smoothly here. Yeah. We had to get some technological things worked out earlier this week, and Kevin was just right there for us. I also want to thank Sydney and Nancy Kirkpatrick, because quite frankly, I wouldn't be up here tonight if it weren't for them. Sydney had encouraged me to get up here and do this talk, and I did it last year, and I had so much fun they asked me to come back. So I want to thank them. And then, of course, the biggest thanks go out to my partner in love, in crime, in work, Valerie Jones. Valerie, stand up for just a second, okay? Valerie shares all those awards with me and quite frankly provides me the love, the feedback, the tea, and the sympathy that I need when I'm putting some of these things together. So all these images you're going to see tonight, they're all Valerie's. So if you don't like them, just make sure you bring that to her attention. Okay? So if you don't mind, I would really love to be able to pick up where we left off last year. And at last Congress, yeah, those are some old pictures there, right? Back in the 1980s, I spent a number of years here in Virginia Beach. I moved back to New Jersey, and then I've come back again. But in the 1980s, I was studying the Edgar Cayce readings, and simultaneously, I was going to what was then CBN University, now Regent. No, I'm not schizophrenic. I haven't been diagnosed, though, either. So back in those days, I was doing both of those things at the same time. I was even the anchor of their news site program, 7 a.m. on Sunday mornings. When you see my hairstyle, doesn't it remind you of the band Flock of Seagulls or something out of the 1980s? And the reason I paired these two together last year is because aside from their attraction to Virginia Beach, in some ways, I think they've had a pronounced impact on American spirituality, where it has been and where it's going. After the talk last year, we all kind of figured this was the first time that Pat ever appeared on the stage here at A.R.E. So if I can use it by way of a segue, why don't we call this one The Odd Couple Part 2. These two men, Edgar Cayce and Pat Robertson, in some ways share a mutual story, emblematic of the soul of America. They represent two counterbalancing forces in many ways. Where do they meet? Where do they diverge? And again, how is this going to shape American spirituality? These are not the only people that represent the mystical and the fundamental, but they're right here, and I think that they represent those forces quite well. Now, before we leave the whole notion of Virginia Beach, some of you folks who live here in Virginia Beach probably are aware that we had a rather dramatic cultural event here earlier this year. It was called Something in the Water. Pharrell Williams is a native Virginia Beach icon. He's a producer, he's a rap and hip hop artist, editor, etc., Grammy Award winner. And he decided he wanted to bring a lot of the top acts in his genre to Virginia Beach. And he did exactly that. Now, Virginia and Virginia Beach has a very interesting racial background, if you will, or history. 25 years ago, we actually had some riots here in town. So Pharrell decided he wanted to bring this festival here not just as an entertainment opportunity, but as an opportunity to heal. And so what he did was he brought these people in. And I have to tell you, Valerie and I actually went to one or two nights. Now, I'm a little too young for hip hop. But I have to tell you, to stand among people, tens of thousands of people, jumping up and down in unison, in ecstatic harmony, is something to behold. Even if you don't care about the music, to be in that sight, in that situation, is truly contagious. And here's the thing that Pharrell did, which was just amazing. He set the intention. He set the intention. Because you know what? Things go better with prayer and meditation. So the first night of Something in the Water, our own John Van Auken from A.R.E. conducted a meditation Friday night at the convention center. The next night, Deepak Chopra led a meditation and a panel discussion with Van Jones of CNN, and they discussed the Redemption Project. The next day, on Sunday, they had a pop-up church. Now, what's interesting about Pharrell is that his father, actually his uncle, is an evangelical preacher. So he's got a little of that fire and brimstone in him, right? But anyone who's been here at A.R.E. for a while knows that you've seen Pharrell here on the grounds, right? In the bookstore, on occasion, keeps a low profile. But he's quite clearly interested, and probably it was the main reason that he asked John to lead that meditation on that Friday night. So again, he set the intention, and you know, you've probably heard stories of in cities where there are churches or houses of worship, that those places in that vicinity, the crime rate is lower. You've probably also heard stories of when meditators have gone into cities. Garland Landreth, who's been on this stage, talked about it. He was one of the initiators of this in the 1980s. They would go into cities and they would meditate in droves. And for some reason, crime rates would drop and accident rates would drop. People were scared about this. Let me tell you something. Here in Virginia Beach, there was some trepidation about this. But you see, Pharrell decided that beneath the celebration, beneath the noise, beneath the loudness, beneath the entertainment, there was going to be something quiet and still to set the stage. And keep that in mind as I talk tonight, because that's a theme that you're going to see over and over again. Throughout the weekend, here he is with Gayle King, you can see the shirt he's wearing. It says Holy Spirit. Now, years ago, you may remember Oprah Winfrey would talk about Holy Spirit on her show. And they'd write in, and she got a lot of flack for this. They said, are you talking about the Holy Spirit? Are we talking about the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit? And she says, no, I'm just talking about Holy Spirit. He wore this all weekend, kind of as a touchstone. And he said this: the level of talent and artistry that vibrates in Virginia Beach is magical. They say there's something in the water. Well, Mr. Williams, last year we said it first, kind of, you know. We were talking about CBN and A.R.E. here. We said there's something in the air here. There's something energetic. There really is something about Virginia Beach that even Mr. Cayce talked about. In fact, Cayce and Robertson both said they came here to fulfill their mission because of the energy here, because of the vibration. It was a sacred place to them. And that's why they came. The evolution of a new American spirituality, the soul of America, is represented by two branches. And these two branches that we'll talk about tonight, one mystical, metaphysical, esoteric, the other one a little bit more fundamental, more traditional, more evangelical. Now, in the panel, when Mitch and Kathy and Brian meet, we were going to talk a little bit more about the Black and Jewish and atheistic spiritual experience in this nation. But for the sake of this talk right now, take a look at these two branches and imagine that they tell a story of the soul of this nation. One, a leading evangelical speaker in the vein of the Great American Awakenings, Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, Dwight Moody, who, by the way, Edgar Cayce actually had a chance to meet Dwight Moody, Billy Graham, and Jerry Falwell. The other branch of that tree, or representing the other branch of that tree, is the most noted and gifted psychic in American history, in my humble estimation. His spirituality and the source of his spirituality went back to a great primordial spirituality, back to Egypt. And if you believe Cayce, or Francis Bacon, or Plato, it actually went back to Atlantis. Cayce was the first one, basically, to introduce the world to the Essenes, to the past lives of Jesus, to the great mystical traditions of every great religion. So these two prominent worldviews, represented by these two men. Oh, let me just make a statement here too. Edgar Cayce, of course, according to Peter Woodbury, who you folks have seen here on the stage as well, said that he was the father of holistic medicine, but he also saw him as the forerunner of holistic theology, and that he represents the very core of the New Age movement and its resonance with the masses. Now again, these two prominent views of these two men, and again, they're not the only ones, but somewhere here in the 21st century, I believe they're going to converge or collide. What will American spirituality look like in the future? Will the U.S. actually meet its spiritual destiny? Is there another great awakening in the cards? Let's take out our crystal ball. All right, so we're going to travel into the future and pretend for a moment that you folks are sitting in this auditorium 100 years from now. It's the 22nd century. 2119. Here we go. In the last century, the 21st century, the nation and the world teetered perilously close to authoritarianism, to greed, to self-destruction. Edgar Cayce had a name for this. He called it the Sons of Belial. I always make sure I get the pronunciation right. It's not Belial, as Pat always tells me. Did I get it right? Thank you. The force behind this consciousness, the sons of Belial, were those who were greedy, those who were selfish, those who would drag society down for their own benefit. And looking back from the 22nd century to the 21st century, at a time, these folks held sway. Now, in the 22nd century, Virginia Beach is still here, according to Mr. Cayce and his dreams. It's a gleaming city by the sea. But across the nation and around the world, sea levels have indeed risen. The pole has shifted, as Mr. Cayce suggested it would. America and its system is sorely challenged. There was indeed, across the world, around the world, violence, political chaos, and mass migration. Had we ignored a reading from Mr. Cayce, a warning that said if there is not acceptance in America of the closer brotherhood of man, the love of the neighbor as self, civilization must wend its way westward, things got stretched. I don't know, is this a little too dark? Peter Russell, who is a great visionary and author, said that throughout evolution, crisis has played a critical role. When things got stretched, that's when major shifts happened. So amidst the political, the climatological, the polarization, the chaos, America never lost its tether to its inner light. It never lost sight of who it was. It met its destiny. It met its spiritual destiny. It stayed tethered to its highest spiritual ideals. The constitutional system bent, but it did not break. Civilization did not have to wend its way westward, as Cayce suggested it might have, because America matched its greatest vision with action, helping move a world closer to oneness. We had moved to pogo philosophy. We have met the enemy, and he is us. In some ways, there had indeed been a great awakening as we look back. The planet's consciousness hit a critical mass. People were now choosing love over fear. It was reminiscent of what Cayce talked about, what happened in Atlantis, the children of the law of one. Sadly, they did not prevail. But in this instance, in this time, in the 21st century, they came to the fore because a new spirituality, a new science, a new understanding of previous civilizations, and the opening of the Hall of Records, among other things, got us through. The tide had turned. By the 2050s, we figured it out. Now, going back to the 20th century, we saw that the song Imagine by John Lennon actually turned out to be pretty prescient. Imagine no religion. It's easy if you try. And by the 22nd century, religion had largely evaporated, although spirituality hadn't. In fact, spirituality was much stronger, much ebullient, much more wider and brighter than it had ever been before. In fact, it matched the cosmic spirituality that Albert Einstein himself had talked about centuries earlier. The whole notion of hell, gone up in flames to the dustbin of history. The Jesus of the 22nd century, he's the great example. He didn't come to be a savior. He didn't come to start a new religion. He was here to be the great example of what a human being could be, of what a human being must become. He was not the great exception. He was the great example. And what else changed? Science changed. The whole notion of scientific materialism began to evaporate. That whole notion that inside your brain, inside your cranium, your consciousness starts here. It all comes from that muscle, that piece of flesh inside your cranium. By the 22nd century, they figured it out. Consciousness was non-local. Your brain wasn't the boss. Consciousness was ubiquitous. It was all around us. And science was proving that. Some of the research into near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences showed that consciousness survived our body. And as the poles shifted, so did humankind itself. Homo sapien evolving into Homo noeticus, a new type of human being. Was this what Cayce meant when he talked about a fifth root race? Things, indeed, had changed. A new world was upon us. It started to look like the Aquarian Age, like 1,000 years of peace. America had indeed awakened. It had fulfilled its spiritual destiny. One that started somewhat inauspiciously 400 years before.
But you've made no plans whatsoever for where you're headed when you leave this world. Hell is a place. It is a place that existed before you were ever born.
Yeah, the first Great Awakening, all the Great Awakenings were full of sound and fury, fire and brimstone, getting right with God, making sure you were on the right side of Jesus. First one started around 1730, the second one about 1790, and preachers rode up and down the circuit. Jonathan Edwards, John Wesley, and George Whitefield rode up and down the coast of America. George Whitefield actually rode 5,000 miles in 1 year and gave 350 preachings under tents in America. This helped bring the country together. John Wesley was there to tell people about their one-on-one relationship with God. Now, this was a big jump. By the First Great Awakening, people were realizing that they had this one-on-one relationship. They didn't have to go through a priest or a vicar or a rabbi. They had this relationship. Now, at the same time, the preachers were also giving you a sense of guilt. And, of course, Jesus was indeed the only way. John Wesley tried to preach to the Native Americans, and he kind of hit a bump here because Native Americans, of course, had their own spirituality. It was tied to the earth. It was tied into nature. But Indians, the Native Americans, started to learn that if they didn't basically become converted, they would lose their land and they would lose their sense of identity. Some of them actually brought Christianity and merged that with their Indian spirituality, but in the end, it didn't work. They lost their land and they lost their way of life. Now, the First Great Awakening, would you like to see what people think about it today? This is a short clip from our friends over at CBN, the 700 Club.
You hang by a slender thread, with the flames of divine wrath flushing about.
Enfield, Connecticut, July 8th, 1741. A 38-year-old American evangelist by the name of Jonathan Edwards delivered what became one of the greatest sermons ever preached in America. The title, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God.
And as history records, the people there in that church came under such conviction that they gripped the pews.
Some historians credit that single sermon by Jonathan Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, for sparking one of the greatest moves of God this nation has ever seen. It became known as America's First Great Awakening.
So did you get all that? Got any questions? I love the part what Dr. David Dunn says, you know, the people in the pews, they were so under conviction, they actually dug their fingers into the pews themselves. Well, were they under conviction or did they merely feel convicted? So, you know, beneath, even though I poke fun here, let me raise a point. I think it's really important. Is that despite the fact that most of the people in this room would say, look, that's not my spiritual lineage, that kind of, you know, fire and brimstone. The fact of the matter is this. The American Revolution would never have happened without this First Great Awakening. The passion, the emotion, the bringing together of a nation would never have occurred unless this emotional movement was present in the country. It actually bound a people together. Don't forget, we weren't even a nation at that time. And so that emotional binding, I should say, was probably also the same spark plug that started the American Revolution. Now, while all of this was going on, all of this noise, this din of Puritanism and Calvinism, what was running underneath that? What were the silent runnings beneath the loud spiritual experiences of the First Great Awakening? Enter Francis Bacon, a Rosicrucian, a Freemason, in fact, probably the father of European Freemasonry. And he's not the only one, but he's largely responsible for this movement. Men and women like him, I should move back for a moment, men and women who believed what he believed actually brought forth the whole notion of this mystical core of America. Jacob Dudelman, who wrote the book, The Soul of America, actually the American Soul, Rediscovering the Wisdom of the Founders, said that America has a mystical core to it. And it was Bacon and men and women like him who, beneath the Calvinist and puritanical din, brought forth this mystical core, made way for this, so that Freemasonry and Unitarianism and Quakerism and Deism and Rosicrucianism could make their way into America, into the consciousness of this nation. And make no mistake, the planting of this wisdom is in this room today. This is part of the great lineage. And also make no mistake that without this, we wouldn't have had the American Revolution either. Because it wasn't just, again, the loud voices. It was the voices of the Quakers who talked about the inner light, the inner light, that of God in every man. Mark Finnan, in a recent venture inward, said that the key principles enshrined in our Constitution by America's founding fathers flow from philosophical ideas that are the pillars of American Freemasonry. Masons appealed to this notion of America because they believed innately in free will, democracy, and the brotherhood of man. Now, Edgar Cayce gave tons of readings about America, about our founding fathers, about all of our ideals. I couldn't possibly go through half of them tonight, but I've got 3, and I just want to pick out just a couple of short passages. And what I've tried to do is highlight them in yellow. Anyone who's read Uncle Edgar's readings knows that they can be a little convoluted from time to time. You almost need an interpreter, so bear with us as we go through some of this. Oh, and again, this is about the Masons and Rosicrucians, of course. One of the other reasons that Americans were attracted to these societies is that they also felt that when you're insurrecting against the king, it's probably a good idea to pass your messages through secret societies. And that's what they did. The Masons and the Brothers of the Rosy Cross, the Rosicrucians, actually helped stir the fire that made the American Revolution possible. So here's Uncle Edgar. So you learn from Jefferson, Franklin, Washington, Hancock that a nation, too, may have a soul. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In another reading given to a man who apparently was President John Quincy Adams in a previous life, he said, "These are the purposes upon which this land was founded. That freedom of speech, freedom of purpose for worshipfulness of creative forces, according to the dictates of one's own conscience, shall never perish from the earth." And then this curious reading that really pretty much spells it out as clearly as I've seen in his readings about the Masonic influences in our land. For with those changes that will be wrought, and this is after the Second World War, Americanism, with the universal thought as expressed by the Masonic order, will be the eventual rule in the settlement of affairs in the world. Not that the world is to become a Masonic order, but the principles that are embraced in same will be the basis of the new order of peace to be established in 44 and 45. And of all the readings that Mr. Cayce gave, some of the most interesting ones, well, one of the most interesting ones was this fellow right here. And I want to bring up Benjamin because I could talk about any founding father tonight, but this guy takes the cake. Because if anybody straddled the two worlds of the soul of America, a man who really, I think, had mystical inclinations, but played in both worlds very well, it's this guy right here. So he's raised a Presbyterian. Throughout his life, he kept a Bible in his drawer. He wrote notes in the margins. When it came time to save our country, if you will, at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, when it was ready to fall apart, he said to the congregants there that day, "Pray." In the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, we had daily prayer in this room for divine protection. Have we now forgotten that powerful friend? I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. He also really enjoyed George Whitefield's evangelizing. So in some ways, you could see how fundamentalists might say, well, Ben's one of us. That's simple, right? All right, let's take a look at the other side of the coin. So as a young Presbyterian, walking through the streets of Philadelphia in the 1750s, he's approached by a Calvinist on the street who hands him a tract about Unitarianism. Maybe if you were walking down the street, they handed you a tract about A.R.E. and said, "Stay away from this stuff, it's bad for you." He hands him a tract about Unitarianism and says, "Stay away from this. If you want to lose your soul, this is how you can do it." Franklin reads through it, and in his own writings he said, "Not only did it not dissuade me, it intrigued me. I embraced it. I became a Unitarian." Franklin remained a Unitarian his entire life, and in his Poor Richard's Almanac, he touted astrology. He believed in reincarnation. He put it on his grave. If you ever want to read something fascinating, see what Benjamin Franklin actually wrote on his gravestone, or had written on his gravestone. The other very, I would say, metaphysically oriented or broad-mindedness of Benjamin Franklin is that he convinced a lot of his founding father brothers, if you will, that it was a good idea to include the Iroquois Confederacy in the Constitutional Convention. So he brought all of this to the country. He also published books for a great mystical group in Ephrata, Pennsylvania. And finally, he was the one commissioned who brought the Great Seal of America to the United States, which we'll cover a little bit later. So there's Benjamin, great man, inventor, innovator, diplomat, ladies' man, an Orthodox believer, and that's why some people like to call him America's Merlin. Our second Great Awakening.
I remember Father dear in that old-fashioned day, how his voice would rise and swell when he
There was some sound and fury here too, not as much as the first Great Awakening. In some ways, it was a little kinder and gentler. Preachers Charles Finney and Lyman Beecher, who was the father of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. They also rode up and down the coast. They had huge camps in the burned-over district in New York. They fell on their knees. They were speaking in tongues. They were talking about Revelation. They were talking about 1,000 years of Jesus ruling. They were talking about millennialism, apocalypse, Baptists and Methodists on fire for Jesus. Now, the second Great Awakening, though, had something over the first. It was democratized. Guess what? You weren't predestined to go to heaven or hell. You actually had a choice. The other thing was that there were a lot of men and women of color who showed up at these particular campsites. As a matter of fact, one woman said to be the first black evangelical preacher was named Jarena Lee. And she was told to preach the gospel. A voice said to her, I will put words in your mouth and will turn your enemies to become your friends. Now, these people were sinners in the hands perhaps of a less angry God, but you still needed a Savior, because if you didn't have Jesus, they were going to still dangle you over the fire pits like a spider and drop you in unless you believed in Jesus. Now, again, all kidding aside, the way the First Great Awakening helped stir the American Revolution, without these folks, we never have the great cultural changes of the 19th century. We never have a civil war. You've all seen this picture, right? John Brown. John Brown, the Calvinist on fire for Jesus. He was the man who ignited the fire that started the Civil War. Now, again, much like the earlier Great Awakenings, there was a spiritual counterpart that was softer and gentler, that ran beneath the din and the loudness of the time. These folks. Anybody can identify these people just by looking at them? Any takers? Okay, there's one. Thoreau. Okay, good. These are the great American there you go, thank you. These are the great American transcendentalists. Yes, Thoreau, Emerson, Whitman, Alcott, Fuller, many of them. And these are the people that didn't believe that you were innately bad. They believed that man was essentially good. What a concept. That you didn't need to have a savior. That their spirituality was all about the unity of man, God, and nature. Man was essentially good. It was all about oneness. It was all about a universal soul. Now, is that beginning to sound a little bit more like Edgar Cayce? They were the direct descendants of Americans' mystical core, and they took decisive action. That's what set them apart. They were at the head of the anti-slavery movement. They were at the rise of women's rights, suffrage movement, labor movement. Heck, even you could say Walden Pond was the beginning of the environmental movement in our country. These transcendentalists took a page out of the Masons' book, and they also began spreading the teachings, drawing from the mystical traditions of both the East and the West. And what did that open the way for? It opened the way for these folks. Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society, Manly P. Hall and his Philosophical Research Society, Rudolf Steiner, Anthroposophical Society, Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, of course, with Unity, and Ernest Holmes, Religious Science, and last but not least, Edgar Cayce and the Association for Research and Enlightenment. Was this the consciousness that Cayce was referring to when he said, the spirituality of the American people will be rather as the criterion of that as is to become the world's forces? Is America ready for a great new awakening? Something different than we have experienced before? A real shift? Let's listen to Steve Dinan, who is with the Shift Network.
How can America fulfill its highest destiny as a country? It's not a small question, it's an important question, not just for us, but really for the whole world, because the world cannot go to its next level until we go to ours. The truth is, right now we're kind of stuck. We have polarized politics, we have corruption, we have overconsumption and greed. America's gotten self-indulgent and, frankly, a bit lazy. The truth is that we are made of finer stuff. We're going to have to return to the sacred values that our founding fathers put in the codes with which we've created this country. Liberty for all, equality, justice, and opportunity. And underneath all of these values is the principle of oneness, which you may not see right at first, but if you think about our national motto, E pluribus unum, it means out of many, one. So we are always leading towards greater wholes, towards more oneness. And that applies not just to what's happening within our own borders, but literally the entire planet. That America's sacred mission is to lead us towards oneness as a world.
To lead us towards oneness as a world. Now, regardless of what you might think about Marianne Williamson's politics, I'm not here to bring her here in today to discuss that, but to reference the fact that she's written about America so often and its spiritual destiny. And she said, we need to do a fierce moral inventory as a nation. We're headed either for total destruction or a new enlightenment. You know, Edgar Cayce gave this very interesting reading. And like a lot of his readings, we can all take it upon ourselves to interpret it. I'm just going to put this one up here. See how you interpret it. Just as man has done throughout the ages, and again, I've highlighted in yellow so we can get to the truth of the reading, if you will. Just as man has done throughout the ages, in the present, as one takes of those various nations, sought to establish as that idea of that nation, of that people, some symbol that does represent those people in those days of the fathers of the present land called America. Some symbol that represents the fathers of the people that were standing there in front of Edgar in the 1940s. What symbol was he talking about? I can't help but think this is the symbol. This is the symbol that comes down through the ages. It comes down from Masonic and Rosicrucian legacy. It is the eye of providence. It graces Mitch Horowitz's first book. That powerful symbol is the all-seeing eye of God. It's on the reverse side of your $1 bill. You already probably know that. It sits atop the Great Pyramid, and on it the words, God favors or smiles on our undertaking. And Cayce went further. Again, he brought the Masons up in other readings, and he talks about a symbol and representing the peoples of that, the fathers of the people of that land. These were the grandfathers and the great-grandfathers of those people who were living at the time of Edgar Cayce. And he also said this very curiously as well. He suggested that Masonic principles can actually be traced back to the Essenes. Again, that ancient Judaic sect that prepared the way for Jesus, which not only coincidentally was called the Brotherhood or the White Brotherhood. But Cayce mentions the pyramids and the Essenes in the same breath. Was the building that was to be the Hall of the Initiates, of that sometimes referred to as the White Brotherhood. In this same pyramid did the great initiate, the master, take those last of the Brotherhood degrees with John, the forerunner of him at that place. Now, if you're new to the Cayce readings, that is absolutely going to blow your circuitry. It's just going to knock you out of the box. Because what Cayce's talking about here is Jesus, the pyramids, and our future all in one reading. But, you know, the source didn't have an ego, it just let it fly. And in that reading, of course, he brings forth the notion that, again, this is an initiation chamber. So is it a mere coincidence that this great Masonic-inspired symbol plugs into some of the deepest mysteries of the Cayce readings about Jesus, the pyramids, and our future? And here's something really odd. There's a corresponding reading in the Bible, I think, with this very symbol. And here it is, Matthew 6:22. Let thine eye be single, and thy whole body shall be full of light. Let thine eye be single, and thy whole body shall be full of light. So we've got this tether, we've got this tie-in with the Masons, with this symbology, with the Cayce readings. Is it easy enough to see which branch of the tree Cayce was from? This whole idea of single, of unity, of oneness. We may be egos in this world, but the dichotomy is not our essential nature. You know, it's not about us and them. It's not about the God and devil. It is not about heaven and hell. A new great awakening, will the mystical, metaphysical, and those silent runnings beneath the loud din come to the fore in this next century, in our lifetimes? Will this be the greater consciousness expression of this nation and in this world at this time? Could there be anything more important in our lives and in the lives of our nation right now than to start getting the essence of that message? And if you need some inspiration to see where we might be going, go back to Uncle Albert. The religion of the future will be a cosmic religion. It should transcend a personal God and avoid dogmas and theology, covering both the natural and the spiritual. It should be based on a religious sense arising from the experience of all things, natural and spiritual, as a meaningful unity. And these words from Pierre de Chardin, who's also called the father of the New Age. I believe that the Messiah whom we await, whom we all, without any doubt, await, is the universal Christ. That is to say, the Christ of evolution. Edgar Cayce, Manly Hall, John Fetzer, Francis Bacon, heck, I could add Carolyn Mace and Stephen Dinan and Marianne Williamson to that list. All had written definitive tomes on the spiritual destiny of the United States. And as I hope I've made clear here today, there are two distinct branches to this soul of America. Both have played an integral role. They will be intertwined. They will interact. There will be a convergence or a collision coming up in our lifetimes. There will be a definitive meeting of the minds one way or the other as we move down this track. You know, and the question must be, what is our role? And how are we going to contribute to this interactivity? You know, last year when I talked about Cayce and I talked about Robertson, I said that each entity had something to learn from the other, that there was a shadow side for both organizations, and one could learn from the other. For Robertson and CBN, I said it quite plainly. I would hope that they would move in, that they would find the more mystical Christ, that they would maybe read the Gnostic Gospels and broaden their horizons when it came to the mystical Christ. And for us at A.R.E. and the Edgar Cayce Institute, to go out, to take this message forward. You know, Charles Thomas told a very interesting story years ago about how he used to be a little embarrassed when his dad would call this place the Spook House on the Hill. And he really didn't want to go out and talk about it. You know, when you're on the leading edge of things, sometimes you like to pull back. There really is safety in numbers. I think in this day and age, those of us who were involved, as Mitch said last night, the new age, and he said it proudly, good for him, that we need to be able to speak our minds and to speak up and to speak about our philosophy unapologetically. And that doesn't mean being a forceful, you know, praise Jesus, get out there and anoint others and try to evangelize. It's not about evangelicalism at all. But I think it is about being honest and being proud of these roots, because face it, we're not here in this room unless we go all the way back and see all the brave men and women who brought these messages forward. That's why we're here today, and that's why we're bringing this work forward. I love that Sidney Kirkpatrick when he named his book, although, yes, Mitch, you're right. I asked him last year, weren't you going to name your book The Messenger? Because you had mentioned that. And he said, yeah, he was going to call it The Messenger. For some reason, I guess the publishers didn't want that. And maybe that's a good thing. It was called An American Prophet, and I love the fact that he and Mitch's eponymous book, Occult America, actually tie in America with the great mystical traditions of this nation. Say it loud and say it proud. You got it. Occult America and An American Prophet. Because make no mistake, there is a proud association with this mystical tradition, personified also in this man, Edgar Cayce. He is a pioneer for America. He is a prophet for America. He is a great American story, a true American hero. He is a product of the great American mystical tradition. And this one you can shout from the mountaintops if you'd like. The tapestry of American greatness includes Edgar Cayce. Now, what will the new awakening, great awakening, look like? Is it going to happen in our lifetimes? I don't know. But for me, I know that the day I'm able to go back to Studio 7 over at the Christian Broadcasting Network and talk extensively about the beauty and the perceptiveness and the wisdom of the Edgar Cayce readings, then I'll know that time has arrived. Thank you very much. Now for the second part of our evening, we're going to, I don't know if I've lost my microphone or not. Can you hear me all right? Okay, good. For the second part of our evening, I'll ask the volunteers to come on up. And Kevin is going to lift up the screen here in just a second. Let me go ahead and move this for you, Kevin. We're going to move the screen here in a second and reveal our next guest behind the curtain here. That's right. And we'll bring up our other folks here in just a second. Just a quick reminder, it was said earlier, but if you do have questions for us and our panel tonight, please write them out on the index card that you've been given. And then just raise your hand and one of the volunteers will come around and they'll bring it up to the stage and we'll go from there. So why don't I go ahead and, you know what? Why don't we go ahead and introduce our guests, bring them up. You've already heard about them. Mitch Horowitz, of course, and Kathy Callahan will join us tonight. And Mitch, if you come right up here, sir, speak right here, sit right here. No, right here, Mitch. You're here on the outside. And Kathy Callahan will join us here. And Kevin, do we have Brian with us? He's still looking like a symbol. Let's see here. Brian Wilson is with us tonight. All right, Brian. This is Brian Wilson. You thought there was only one Brian Wilson, right? Brian C. Wilson. He is a professor of comparative religion at Western Michigan University. He has written this fantastic new book. I think I might have it right up here. There it is. If you could plug that one in, Kevin, from my computer. This is the book, John Fetzer and the Quest for the New Age. There it is. And I think you all should have gotten complimentary copies or will be getting complimentary copies. This kind of just came together organically because I was really looking for a great panel. And there are actually 3 people who wrote in the same Venture Inward issue that I wrote in about founding mystics. Brian was in there, and Brian, I've had a chance to go ahead and read your book, and it's amazing, and I think you folks will find out that it's the same thing. So Brian Wilson joining us from Michigan tonight. Also on the panel tonight is Kathy Callahan, and Kathy, you know, this was a little quick interesting story here. I was, again, looking for just the right panelists. And I figured, well, Kathy looks like she would just fit this bill nicely. I wonder if we can bring her in by Zoom from Hawaii. And Kevin, today, she says, oh, she's going to be there. I said, great. Bring her in. Kathy has written a number of books on metaphysical topics and healing. She wrote a great article about 9-10 years ago on Benjamin Franklin. That caught my interest, and I said, okay, this looks like it's a good fit. And she does live in Hawaii. And one of my friends said, Kathy is military, and you'll probably figure that out in the first few minutes. So Good to have Kathy with us tonight. And Mitch Horowitz, of course, I've had the pleasure and the honor of interviewing many times. I've really conversation on radio a number of times. And Mitch, of course, his initial book on Occult America, but he's written on so many diverse esoteric topics, from Edgar Cayce, of course. He's talked about some of the writings of Norman Vincent Peale and the positive thinking movement, and his latest book deals with Manly Pete Hall, if I'm not mistaken, right? All right, so let's go ahead and start with the questioning, and I'm going to start with Mitch here, and Kevin, if you could just bring this question up on the screen for us, and here it is. There we go. You said, I gleaned one of your quotes from years ago, so this may seem like a gotcha question, but it's not quite that. You said this about Manly P. Hall, but you could have said it really about Cayce or others. You said, I believe his work may provide succor during this troubled and divisive period in American history. Although each generation believes that it lives on some kind of precipice, I have never before seen Americans angrier, more divided, and less possessed of confidence than I do right now. So my question to you, Mitch, and then anyone else on the panel can jump in. How does this polarization rectify itself? Is it gradual? Is there a flashpoint? And how does our spirituality work in all through that? It's not an easy question.
No. My conviction is that the polarization rectifies itself first and chiefly with the individual. I don't think there's any five-point plan. I don't necessarily see any charismatic leader on the horizon who's going to lead us to cleaner, purer waters to drink from. I think, and I mean this very deeply and very personally and intimately, that each individual has to assume with a great deal of vigor some responsibility for restoring a sense of civic dialogue to our nation. And that means not participating in humiliation of people, not participating in the kind of gossip and sarcasm and hate-mongering that runs so wild in our digital culture, which is to say, digital culture has become synonymous with the culture itself. And I think we have to renew within ourselves a sense of protection of the individual search for meaning. We are trapped in this mindset of calling something good or bad based on whether we like it or dislike it, which is the most rock bottom way of engaging with any idea. Looking at an idea or looking at an individual and asking ourselves internally, and usually very, very quickly, does what this individual believe or does what this individual stand for match what I already have in me? And if so, I'm happy, and if not, I'm hostile. That's become our essential engagement with one another. It's not necessarily new, but digital culture has made it a lot more coarse, a lot more present, and I feel very strongly that individuals have to take responsibility for restoring a sense of
So the question then to you, Mitch, is,
unity.
and maybe I'll go to Brian with this, but Brian, if Mitch is right that we really do need to all individually move towards this goal of perhaps realizing that we are indeed brothers, that we are of one soul, if you will, whether you're conservative or liberal or you know, a CBNer or an A.R.E.er. But how, again, does it rectify itself? What does it possibly look like? And you can give me a scale from, you know, the best to the worst. But is there a reckoning coming up? Because, and the reason I say that, I'm not trying to be baleful here. But in times past in our country, when we've had this kind of polarization, you know, you saw in what I raised earlier, the American Revolution, there was a flashpoint. Civil War, polarization, there was John Brown, there was a flashpoint. Some people say this is getting a little, it's not there yet, but we're getting a little close there. So Brian, my question to you is, other than the individual effort, which is absolutely germane and important, what does it look like, and maybe what's the best outcome here? Is there a reckoning coming?
Well, I think the best outcome is what you predict for 2050, which is a kind of total revolution, which I really appreciate, because for the last few months, we've of course heard from environmentalists that 2050 is going to be the kind of the environmental apocalypse. And I certainly hope that's not the case. So you're presenting a kind of more hopeful vision of the future, which I really appreciate. And I think it's we have to confront these things. But on the other hand, it's hard to have hope in face of the apocalypse. So a lot of it has to do with our rhetoric. We have to dial down the rhetoric. We have to basically get rid of the apocalyptic language. We have to think in terms of centuries instead of in the next 5 years, the next 5-year plan. And I think that's the root. The interesting thing is John Fetzer was really taken by a story that was told in a newspaper in the 19th century. And this is the story of an angel coming to George Washington at Valley Forge. And according to this story, the angel predicted 3 trials. And it's pretty clear that the first trial, of course, for the nation was the Revolutionary War. The second trial was the Civil War. But who knew what the third trial would be? Now, everybody who reads that story is led to believe that it must be some kind of flashpoint. It must be some kind of apocalyptic event. But perhaps not. Perhaps we can work for something that's a smoother landing. And that's the kind of thing I would like to work for.
Brian brings up a story from the National Tribune in 1870, where General Sherman, who had fought at Valley Forge with Washington, purportedly told a journalist that Washington had an angelic vision at Valley Forge, and that America was going to face 3 great trials. But through all of those trials, and I think he said something like this, Brian, even as the dew falls from the heavens, even if the entire world is united against her, she will never fall. She will never fail because of this spiritual connection to its destiny. Now, the story might be apocryphal, but Kathy, it still might be one of hope.
Always hope. There is always hope. I believe that. I know many people that I speak to ask the why. Why the polarization? Why do we have, the 2 camps divided? These incidents we see in the news, things that maybe were whispered a couple generations ago or even 10 or 20 years ago are now said out loud in terms of vilifying a person who is different than you. And what I see here is not only the polarization, but I see on the individual level, as Mitch said, it provides the opportunity for those, maybe not in either camp, but for those in the middle, and I believe there are many more in the middle, who will at some point say, enough, I'm not tolerating this from either side. And an incident on the subway, a bystander steps in to stop it, someone who's bullying someone, maybe because they're, dressed obviously as a Muslim, or whatever it may be, those few people that really do call the police because people are speaking Spanish, in a restaurant in California, and they call and they report them thinking they're illegal immigrants and harass them. It's those people in the middle who maybe are not extreme on either side of the 2 poles who are going to say enough. And when enough of those individuals start to do that, then we may have a change.
What do you think that fundamentalists and evangelicals can teach those who are more mystically or metaphysically inclined today? And then we're going to flip it on its head as well. Brian, let's start with you first.
Well, I think one of the things they can teach is the value of the spiritual. Committed Christians are very clear that it's the spiritual over the material. And I think it's that kind of fervency that can be a lesson. Now, the ways it's manifested, and of course there's hypocrisy on both sides, makes it difficult. But I think that's something, especially in our consumer society, that a lot of Americans can look to and take a lesson from. Not that they're going to become evangelical Christians, but they can really kind of reassess the role of spirituality in their own lives.
Mitch, Kathleen?
Well, I admire first of all, I was very glad to see that you continued your pairing of Pat Robertson and Edgar Cayce, because it opens up a lot of interesting doors. And for years, I've admired the evangelist Oral Roberts, who's no longer on the scene. And I wrote an article, I've written about Oral in one of my books, One Simple Idea, and I wrote an article about his theology. And he was a very searching, profoundly serious man in many respects. Interesting incident a few years ago. There was a conservative spiritual journal that accepted an article from me very enthusiastically on the topic of Oral Roberts, where I sort of traced out his career and looked at Oral as a serious religious seeker and theologian. And everything was just delightful. They asked for a little bio blurb and a picture. I sent it to them, and then just dead silence. And I couldn't get anybody there to respond to me for weeks. And finally, it became clear to me that they were having some sort of internal war there and didn't want the piece. So I withdrew it, and I published it with Politico. And I was very disappointed in them, because my feeling was, and I hope there's a personal lesson here that we can all draw upon. My feeling was, can't there be just one New Ager with whom you have a dialogue, with whom you have a back and forth? You know, hold me up as an example of the wrong thing, a misguided guy, but at least let's have a discussion. And I was very disappointed that they would close down the discussion, and by all means, it happens all the time on the left too. And I feel that we just have to tear down some of these fences. There has to be room to have a conversation.
If I can parry off your Oral Roberts comment for a minute, because recently I just saw a great movie called Come Sunday. Has anyone seen it? Come Sunday? It is about an African-American preacher who was actually schooled by Oral Roberts, and he had an awakening. And he started to preach, and this is back in the 1980s or 90s. He starts to preach that to evangelical community, that there is no hell. Well, you can only imagine what happens, and that's what the entire movie is about. He is ostracized, he is kicked out. He had a 1,000-person sanctuary that was filled every Sunday, and even Oral Roberts came to him and said, "Son, you got to get right with God." So maybe, again, along with the lines of what I was talking about, Brian, does hell have a sell-by date?
Well, if you ask my students, I would say yes. Now, of course, hell has been an idea that's been tremendously powerful throughout the history of human beings, that threat. But I'm looking at the rising generation, and I just don't find that fear, even among the students of mine who are professing Christians. So I'd like to believe that this notion of hell and the guilt that goes along with it is a fading idea. Now, maybe that's just the Pollyanna in me, but I see it in my students.
Do you think that as we move more into this century, some of the ideas that I talked about tonight, the end of hell as we know it, the mystical Jesus, if there is a coming together, a convergence that's healthy, that is not a flashpoint, do we see evangelicals, fundamentalists, start moving in the direction of seeing that, well, maybe there is no hell, or maybe the mystical Jesus was a man to show us that he's the great example and not the great exception? Because you folks would probably agree that evangelical churches and traditional churches are probably not there yet. In fact, some are probably holding the line pretty hard. Is that the next step in this evolution, or am I pontificating here?
It may be. I think of the traditional churches who, in the last generation, have moved away somewhat from that concept. You know, I remember of hell.
Got it.
When I'm not Catholic, but I lived in a very Catholic neighborhood, and you know, I remember as a child these types of things, and you know, you're going to hell because of this, you're going to hell because of that. My grandparents, who were Catholic, could not come to my church to see me in any plays or events because they would go to hell if they stepped into a Lutheran church. That's changed. That's greatly changed. So I see not only in the traditional Catholic churches a movement away from that, you know, if you do this, you're going to pay. I also see it in some of the Protestant churches with, you don't get sermons on the fire and brimstone very much anymore. So what I think is if the traditional churches have made already some movement in that direction, although it may seem impossible, I don't think anything is impossible. And that some of the fundamentalists, the Pentecostals, may indeed start to maybe move a little bit away from that as well.
But Mitch, when it comes to Jesus as your Savior, that is a much higher threshold in the evangelical traditional Christian community. That's a pretty tall wall to climb.
It's a tall wall to climb, although I certainly wouldn't begrudge any individual his or her theology. You have belief systems within Judaism, Mormonism, Christian Science, and I have found the ability to speak to individuals, or sometimes fairly large numbers of individuals, within some of those congregations. For example, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which grew out of the burned-over district, William Miller, who himself was a product of some of the Great Awakening activity. The Seventh-day Adventist Church, or individuals within it, have been very good to me, hosting me on radio shows and writing about my books. And I was on a Seventh-day Adventist radio program about 5 months ago, and we were discussing some very controversial topics. And I don't think they're going to invite me to teach at their seminary anytime soon, but they were welcoming, and I appreciated that.
And they treated you well.
Very much so. We had serious discussions. You know.
Brian, you were going to say, it looked like you were going to comment.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've written a couple of books, one on Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, who of course was for a time the most famous Seventh-day Adventist in the world, who eventually left the tradition because his beliefs became more metaphysical, I can say. And then my latest book is on John Fetzer, who also spent considerable time in the tradition. And the interesting thing about Fetzer is when he left Seventh-day Adventism, he didn't leave with rancor. And he maintained very good ties with his friends who were Adventists. He went to an Adventist college, which is today Andrews University. And eventually they even turned around and gave him an honorary degree. So that, I think, is a really good example of how very conservative Christians, and in the case of Fetzer, a New Ager, can dialogue on multiple levels. It's possible. It just takes the will to do it.
You know, most of the people in this room have been exposed, obviously, to Cayce, to a lot of the aspects of the New Thought movement that I talked about earlier. And I talked about Freemasonry, Unitarianism, and Deism, and Rosicrucianism, Quakerism. They don't show much up on the Richter scale these days. You know, it's not like you find a Unity Church in every town, forget every corner. Why do you think that is? If these are pillars of American mystical tradition, and we all think it's as great as sliced bread, why do we find, I mean, the churches even in our town, the 500, 1,000 seat churches are generally evangelical churches, fundamental churches. But Unitarianism, I think we've got, one in the entire Hampton Roads area. What's behind that, do you think? And do you think it might even change? Brian, jump in.
Well, I think the easy answer to that is metaphysicals tend to be not to be joiners, that they don't like institutions because institutions are constraining or potentially are constraining. And of course, this is a great disadvantage in the face of a tradition like evangelical Christianity, which has very strong institutional roots and instincts. So I think that's part of the problem. How do we get people together? How do we get people of a metaphysical disposition to talk to each other on a large scale, on a national scale? And part of the problem, I'll throw this out here, is that, one of the problems is the digital environment is so toxic. Is it salvageable? Can we actually use it, or can people of metaphysical disposition use it to basically be a voice of a different kind than what's out there now?
You know, when you and I were talking a little earlier, Brian, earlier this week, we talked about one of the Pew Research polls that talk about, the largest growing designation in the spiritual firmament these days are the nuns, not N-U-N-S, N-O-N-E-S, that people are not affiliated. And then, I might watch a Bill Maher or Richard Dawkins talk about this, and they say, see, the country's moving towards atheism. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But it's really not that, is it?
No. When they drill down, they ask people, what religion are you? And people say, well, none. And then when they drill down to find out what exactly that means, they find a very small percentage are people who are self-identified as atheist or even agnostic. And the vast majority of that group say they're spiritual but not religious, or some variation on that. So they do have a spiritual life. Sometimes it's quite active, sometimes it's a little bit shallow. But they still think of themselves as spiritual people, even if they don't join a church or a mosque or a synagogue.
What role do you think atheism is going to play in this so-called new age, in this 21st century? Obviously, regardless of what Brian and I see as, the nuns are not just all atheists or agnostics. Undeniably, atheism has grown. And, personally, that doesn't offend me. In fact, in some ways, I personally believe that atheism is very healthy. In some ways, I think it's the wolf outside the caribou pack. There are a couple of diseased caribou that need to go down. So, sorry. Spirituality, religion is spirituality codified, right? And it gets rings of stuff around it. And really, atheism at its very best, I think, tears down the artifice of religion and starts bringing it back to its, pure spiritual roots. So thank God, for the wolves, if you will. They're there to really, literally play a role. What do you guys think about atheism? And in other words, what role do you think it may be playing in the upcoming years?
I think in the past, atheism gets a bum rap. We think atheists don't believe in God, and that automatically brings up some images of negative things. Just because you're an atheist doesn't mean you're not a moral person. Maybe we'll be more recognized in role. Maybe I think most help America become more spiritual in a sense, as we move away from the religious doctrine and move more into spiritual principles.
Good point. Mitch, Brian, do you have a comment on that before we leave that subject?
Well, with regard to atheism, of course, there's the question of the searching individual who may come to the point of regarding him or herself as an atheist, and then there's the question of the intellectual structure and some of the kind of unofficial celebrity spokespeople for atheism. And it seems to me, I look at like Richard Dawkins, for example, and I don't single Richard out alone, there's other folk. And I think that what Richard has done is he has recreated a fundamentalist religious structure at almost every turn. You understand there's a difference between institutional and contemplative religion. To him would
one of the next frontier you've on. You've got a winner there. And if you haven't done this yet, go to YouTube and just plug in Life After Death, John Cleese. Because to me, again, this seems to be another frontier. And parrying off of the atheism we were just discussing, because I would show this to an atheist and just say, hey, take a look at this, because it really seems to me that atheism, like scientific materialism, are almost on the same track, and those foundations are starting to fracture. So that when you look at what DOPS is doing up at UVA, you're starting to see that their studies in near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, kids and reincarnation, all of a sudden, we're thinking, maybe consciousness doesn't start with this between my ears, the cranium. Maybe consciousness, as I was saying in the talk before, is non-local. And if we start moving in that direction, Brian, might that not start pushing some atheists in a direction that maybe they don't even want to go?
Well, perhaps, especially with the authority of science behind it, because that seems to be one of the things that atheists are really promoting, is that they see, especially religion, not necessarily spirituality, but religion as a threat to science. So perhaps with that kind of imprimatur of science behind it, that will occur. The interesting thing about the spirituality today, well, especially, looking at my students again, is that it tends to be very fluid. And where people are today is probably not where they're going to be 10 years from now. So I wonder if atheism is an interesting place to be for a while. And it'll be interesting to see what happens down the road. Will the same people remain atheistic, or will they adopt a spiritual or a religious position? It's not at all fixed. And that's one of the, I think, the good things about the kind of religious spiritual environment of America today. It is fluid. People can change, and people do.
Any other comments on that before we move on to another subject? So what role, I didn't really have time to bring, because I was really looking at the more extreme ends of the two branches of American spiritual experience. But let's talk about some of those things in the middle. I look at the Black and the African American spiritual experience as truly unique in American history. And even today, it seems as though, although they have been, very progressive in some of their notions and moving forward, most of the black churches, and Brian, we'll go to you first and then we'll go down the panel, still seem to be more evangelically based. Are they still more or less ensconced in evangelicalism, or is there a shift? Where has black spirituality come from? Where is it heading in the 21st century, do you think?
Well, evangelical Christianity has really formed the basis for kind of the solidity, the stability of a lot of African American communities over the last few centuries. And so I don't see that as changing anytime soon. It's something that's worked very well for African American communities. There are, of course, other voices out there. There are spiritualist churches that are African American. Of course, there's the Nation of Islam, which has a very interesting kind of esoteric current running through it. Mm-hmm. So there are counterexamples to this, but I would say most African Americans who are religious will probably, for the foreseeable future, remain committed evangelical Christians.
Mitch, I've raised this with you on a radio program, and one of my first questions to you years ago was, how does a nice Jewish boy from Queens, New York, get involved in metaphysics and esoteric matter, right? And of course, you gave a great answer. But, what about the Jewish American experience and spirituality? I know some folks who are Jewish get involved in Kabbalah, but as a movement, if you will, they haven't really moved in large numbers to the esoteric side of the ledger. There really isn't, or maybe you'll know something different. There really is not any kind of prominent mystical or metaphysical Jewish expression in this country right now. True or false?
Well, I do find among individuals, a person can be a traditional believer and might check off a certain box on the census form or on a Pew survey, but might also bring into his or her life all kinds of different practices, from meditation to yoga to acupuncture to energy medicine to macrobiotic eating, and wouldn't necessarily adopt a label and say, I'm a New Ager, or I'm into New Thought, or I'm this, or I'm that. But you start scanning people's bookshelves and you see, every third book is by Deepak Chopra, and they still would, view themselves as a Methodist or a Jew or right, what have you. So I do find that people will incorporate a whole vast network of teachings in their lives without necessarily abandoning the identity that they'll tell to the Pew researcher.
Gotcha. And I know you said you grew up in a Catholic neighborhood, so you can't speak as a Catholic, but I'm also trying to see where in U.S. Catholicism or in international Catholicism there is that mystical end of things. Because as I raised in my talk, I really do believe, and I think Cayce and a lot of those in the New Thought movement, we're pointing towards the great oneness of all religions. And to me, at least, it's the great mystical traditions of those religions. So, you have mystical Christianity, you have Sufism in Islam, you have Kabbalah in Judaism. In Catholicism, Brian, Kathy, do we see anything right now that appears to be moving in that more mystical direction? I mean, Carolyn Mace is a great example of a Catholic who just embraces the mysticism of the Catholic Church. And we often don't talk about the great mystics of the Catholic Church, but there they are.
I think we do have that. There are certain things that have made inroads within Catholicism. I actually explored something called centering prayer, which is practiced in Catholic churches. It's also spread outward. And that originated with Keating, who's a Catholic priest, quite some years ago. Centering prayer, if you look at it and you study it, is another name for meditation. Okay? And so you do have these groups. Now, they will not call it meditation, and I know the church I went to, a Catholic church, they said, don't use the M word before I went there. Don't use the M word, it's centering prayer. But that's basically what it was. And so I do think you have that. And also, I think there's probably more interest in some of the Christian mystics among Catholics today who, of course, were Catholic because I was the only religion at that time. And it's there. It might be quiet. It might be hidden, but the undercurrent is there, and it'll probably continue to grow.
Right, Mitch, Thomas Merton, Meister Eckhart, Hildegard of Bingen. I mean, you could go on and talk about the Catholic mystics. And I was raised Catholic, and I left the church at one point, but I can tell you in the years I was there, I never heard about those mystics.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, I'm quite enamored of the mystical constitution of the church, and I have pointed out on radio and other places that as academic research into ESP and paranormal phenomena has taken a hit for the time being, the Catholic Church is actually one of the few institutions in modern life that dedicates tremendous research and integrity and scholarly effort to the investigation of miraculous claims. And I think these activities are undertaken with a great deal of meticulousness. And a lot of people don't know about it, but there's an extraordinary effort undertaken on the part of the church to investigate claims of the miraculous. And there's a whole vast variety of reasons for that. But the fact is, despite all the storms that are going on campuses where centers for the study of the paranormal or ESP have taken budgetary hits, the church in its own way has continued that, and I'm very admiring of that.
Just a quick reminder, too, if you have any questions for our panel tonight, just raise your hand, give it to a volunteer. They'll bring it up to the front of the room here. Yeah, if there are any volunteers to pick those up, bring them up and hand them to one Valerie Jones. Hey, Kevin, throwing you a little curveball here, but that's what I like to do. I want to play a short video for you here. I think you folks are going to find this to be fairly interesting. This aired on CBN News, the 700 Club, just about 2 months ago. If you're ready for me, Kevin, I'm going to let it roll. Here goes, Kevin.
Earth's magnetic field is the basis for all modern navigation, from airplanes to satellites in space and ships at sea, even Google Maps and smartphones. If it continues to deteriorate, those systems and more are at risk. The Earth's magnetic north was moving even before it was discovered in 1831. It's a natural process driven by molten iron moving deep beneath the Earth's crust. But magnetic north is now moving so quickly that it forced the world's geomagnetism experts to update the world magnetic model a year early. If the Earth's magnetic field decays significantly, scientists say it could collapse altogether and flip polarity, changing magnetic north to south and south to north.
You mentioned about the desiccation thing. If it's really severe, if we lose the magnetic field, that we would be subject to solar flares that could dry up our oceans. Could you talk about that?
Well, again, as long as if we lose our magnetic field for a significant period of time, yeah, it would have catastrophic consequences for animal life on planet Earth. And it's one thing we notice is we got our strong dipole magnetic field just before God created the first animals. I mean, the timing was remarkable.
Oh my God, Pat's talking about pole shifts.
Was that a conference here?
See, Pat's talking from the stage again. He doesn't know it yet. But, you know, things like this, anything related to earth change, and we can bring Brian back in, how does that affect spiritual evolution in our country and around the world? Earth changes, pole shifts, what does that do to people's and their spiritual evolution or de-evolution? Brian, we'll go with you first. You're on the hot seat.
Well, hopefully it gives people a sense of urgency. Now, there's nothing we can do about pole shifts if it occurs, but there are, global things occurring that we can do something about. So maybe it will kind of refocus our energies. I do think that, again, this kind of apocalyptic rhetoric is problematic because it's hard to have hope in the face of the apocalypse. So maybe it will actually reorient people to taking into account a greater part of in their spiritual life. But I'm afraid these kinds of things will just simply scare people into a kind of paralysis.
And maybe even spiritually, they will, in an amygdala sense, they'll kind of, crunch down and hold tighter to what they believe, it will ratchet up fear, and that doesn't help anyone's evolution.
That's right. That's right. That's a problem.
I'm sorry, say that again, Brian?
That's right. I think it's a major problem. Even with something we can do something about climate change, there's such a great sense of helplessness in the face of just how monumental this is, that we see a lot of people just simply avoiding the topic altogether, which is not going to help anybody. So it's an interesting question. How can we kind of reorient ourselves spiritually such that we can actually face these problems, at least the problems we as human beings can solve?
Comments? Earth changes? Spiritual evolution? Anything at all? I mean, we're starting to, I think pretty much the planet is getting the fact. There's still some deniers out there. But I think we're pretty much getting the message that Earth changes or climate change or global warming is upon us. And mass migration could certainly, a lot of people say that, some of the Earth changes taking place in Syria has actually, and in Africa, has actually encouraged, if you will, mass migration. And that can impact lots of things. We know it impacts the national discussion. Just wondering what impact it might have on our own spiritual evolution.
I'd just like to make a comment as an anthropologist that we know from the historical or geological record that environmental change of any kind is a driver in physical evolution. Now, whether it is a driver also in spiritual evolution, that's kind of an interesting question I haven't given a lot of thought to. But from what Brian said, I think you're going to have, again, a couple responses. The paralysis, yes. The fear, the crisis is here, and too afraid, the person too afraid to do anything. And perhaps those will fall back to the more traditional religious beliefs or praying to God or whatever it might be. But it may also be an impetus for others to begin to look beyond their own backyard and look at the world as a whole. And say, if we don't work together, okay, we're all going to be, going down with it.
True.
So,
my father used to raise an interesting point when I grew up in the 60s, and my dad was not a New Age waif. He was a chemical engineer. But growing up as a young kid, we had problems with Russia and China. And he said, there's only really one way this world is ever going to unite. And that's if we get attacked from outer space. Now, you heard the same thing growing up, right? Or something like it. Because the human ego, and I don't mean in the Freudian sense, but I mean, of course, in miracle sense or the Cayce sense, the human ego is about separation. It's about self-preservation. It's that, you and I are not one. We are not ultimately connected. And so it always has to create the other. So I think climate change is an evolution in one sense, because now the other is not another nation. Now the other that we've created is us. We've created, I think largely, created climate problems so that there is an ersatz enemy out there that we all need to unite, because if we don't unite, we're cooked. So as opposed to maybe the English nation that said we better defeat the Germans, otherwise we're done for. In some ways, has climate change been something that we've almost created as a go-between between the heretofore known enemy, if you will, another nation, if you will, to something that we have created ourselves to see, we have met the enemy, and he is us. I've stumped the panel. There are no answers. It's the unanswerable question. Go ahead, Brian.
Interesting question, because did we somehow at some deep psychological level do this in order to set ourselves such a global task that it will force us to evolve spiritually? I don't know if that's true, but it's certainly a very compelling narrative, let's put it that way. It both acknowledges our own part in the problem, but it also basically points to the future that we might be able to solve it as well. So maybe that's the new myth for the 21st century that we need.
Mm-hmm. One presidential candidate said recently that the world needs America now more than ever, but only if America is her best self. What does that look like?
Being true to the ideals that this nation was founded on, being true to the idea of brotherhood, universal brotherhood, social justice. That is how we're true to ourselves as a nation. Cayce obviously had that in a number of readings. But if we deviate from that and we go down the road of self or US before all, not only, I think, are we in danger, the whole world is in danger.
And I would add to that Thomas Jefferson, another founder who had deep sympathies for Unitarianism, and towards the end of his life said that were I to choose a religion, I probably would be a Unitarian. Jefferson made the observation that a real democracy could not be functional without an educated public, without an educated populace. And that's just profoundly important. And it's also very important for me to remember, as I say these words, that upon hearing that and agreeing with it, it's vital that we not jump in our imaginations to who the uneducated people are. You know, we have seen the enemy and it is us. You know, a point that I was going to make earlier, for example, is that I beg your pardon. That's my mother.
You can bring her in.
Yeah.
I want her to ask him a question, is really what I want.
I remember a few years ago, Rudolph Giuliani purposely allowed his phone to go off when he was speaking to a convention of the A.R.E, and it was his wife calling, and he thought it would seem folksy. I assure you I'm not trying to be cloying. I'm just forgetful.
I should have grabbed the phone. Go ahead.
But I'll take the call publicly. Apropos of this thread of being an educated public, one of the things that I've tried to do without a great deal of success is point out to people in mainstream journalism and mainstream academia that you have to stop this caricaturing of the prosperity gospel or other reaches of organized religion that you don't like. I look at all the figures on television who I personally like John Oliver and Rachel Maddow and Bill Maher, and you know, every 3 months or so, the wheel turns around to the prosperity gospel, and they depict it in the most cartoonish, broad stroke terms that are terms that they would correctly identify as terms of bigotry if it were being directed from the other side. So when we talk about the importance of having an educated public, don't just think that it's, you know, Uncle Mike, the loudmouth at Thanksgiving. You know, look in your own house and ask where that has to be done.
Yeah. You know, I've been reading some of Brian Wilson's book on John Fetzer, and you're in for a good read, folks. And I knew John Fetzer was an industrial magnate. He was a broadcasting giant. He owned the Detroit Tigers. I had no idea, Brian, that he had such a rich spiritual heritage, starting with something conventional, but then moving into spiritualism, theosophy. He engaged the Cayce readings. And here's my question for you, Brian. He was one of the first students of A Course in Miracles. What role does the Course in Miracles play in our spiritual evolution today?
Well, it's been called the kind of Bible of the New Age. And for people who want a kind of comprehensive entree into a metaphysical worldview, I couldn't recommend more highly A Course in Miracles. So I think the ideas are all there. And for people who want a kind of, as I said, an introduction, a way into it. Now, John Fetzer was one of the first people who read A Course in Miracles after it was published, and found it just tremendously useful for him. And the interesting thing was that he basically found it useful because it confirmed a lot of the things that he was exploring in other traditions. And so while he never gave up A Course in Miracles, it was a way of kind of connecting the dots for him and for going forward as well. He always continued reading the Course. He had A Course in Miracle groups that he was involved in. But it was also a jumping off point for him too. And it led him into the exploration of a lot of different things.
That was it was rather late in his life though, wasn't it, Brian?
He died in 1991, and he first encountered A Course I think it was 75 or 76. I forget exactly the date.
Oh, okay. It was that early. All right.
Yes.
So it wasn't quite that early towards the end of his life. Course in
No.
Miracles. Thoughts?
I feel it's been just seismically important.
Mm-hmm.
I agree entirely with Brian's assessment. And of course, we currently have a presidential candidate, Marianne Williamson, who came up through the course, and she is going to be included in the first two of the Democratic presidential debates. I am constantly struck by the inroads that the course has made into mainstream life. Again, I find people from Catholic backgrounds, Jewish backgrounds, who are reading A Course in Miracles, and people have personally professed to me the depth of change that it has worked in their life, or the benefits that they've gotten from one of the interpretive books, like Gerald Jampolsky's Love is Letting Go of Fear. But if you ask them, what are you about, what box do you check, they would say Catholic or Jewish or what have you, and yet the course has been a profound part of their lives.
Mm-hmm. Any comments on the course?
Yeah, the course. I mentioned earlier today that you don't read the course. If you read the course, you're not really doing it. You work the course. And it is difficult. It is very difficult. And I think a lot of people give up on it, maybe come back to it. And I think it's underrated, the importance, the impact. And I see that I have to say, I see it a lot among A.R.E. people, because we tend to look at the readings as the quote gospel. But I found the course a great complement to the readings, and it helped me interpret some of the readings a little bit differently. And I think that in the future, we're going to look back, people will look back, and perhaps realize the true impact that it is going to have, or is having.
Gotcha. We're going to answer some of your questions here in just a second. I've got one more question for my panel tonight. So, Edgar Cayce, many of you know, had a dream where he had just come back from Detroit. He was arrested in Detroit for practicing medicine, spent 2 or 3 days in jail. He's on his way back and he's bereft, depressed. And so he has a dream. And in the dream, he is shown that he returns to the United States in 2158, 22nd century. And he's in Nebraska, which is oceanfront. And in the dream, he's a young child, and he's trying to tell these professorial types that he was Edgar Cayce in a past lifetime. So they take him up in a cigar-shaped ship. That's actually in his dream, long before UFOs became a thing here in this country. And they take him to Virginia Beach, which is, as his reading said, is still very much here. And they discover some of his readings. And he came out of this and he tried to interpret it himself, but he actually went to his source and got a reading on his dream. And the reading told him 2 things. Number 1, that there would be a future, and that number 2, his works would be remembered. So now I don't think Cayce had an ego per se, or not much of an ego. I don't think he would care if he was remembered 100 years henceforth as, a very stable genius. But I think he wanted to know whether his works would survive. How will Cayce be remembered 100 or 200 years from now? Will he be remembered as big or as not as large as a Jerry Falwell or a Billy Graham or a Pat Robertson? What does it look like in 100 or 200 years, the legacy of Edgar Cayce, or is he just a small footnote in the history of humankind? Let's go around the panel, and then we'll take your questions. Brian, you first. What do you think?
Well, he's had a tremendous impact, especially with certain themes and issues, Atlantis, past lives, earth changes, those kinds of things. But I think he'll actually be remembered for his readings on energy medicine and alternative health. And I think as we move on and the therapeutic becomes more important, both spiritually, psychologically, and physically, the kinds of connections that Edgar Cayce was talking about will become more and more important. So I think if he's remembered in the future, it'll be for that.
Kathy.
I certainly agree with Brian that he will be remembered as the father of holistic medicine, but I also would like to think that he will be remembered as a prophet of the work with a capital W, and that work has been ongoing for over 10, 12,000 years, dating back to the time of the sinking of Atlantis, the Rata story, when they tried to establish a nation based on the ideals that this nation is established on. And of course, my favorite, Ben Franklin, had readings from Cayce, and he was the elder pharaoh in the Rata story, the father of Hewlin Cayce as the younger pharaoh.
And that was a man named Franklin in this lifetime,
Yeah,
right? When he came to Cayce, that was his name.
Franklin Bradley.
Right.
I believe Franklin Bradley was his name in this lifetime. So the way I see it is this work has been ongoing a very long time. They tried it way back when. They tried it again during the American Revolution. And he came back again, a third, many times I'm sure, but the one that we know about as Franklin Bradley. And he was a board member here on the precursor to the A.R.E., the Association of National Investigators. And he contributed a great deal to the early days of the A.R.E. And so I just see this as a continuation of the work over thousands of years. And I'd like to think that Edgar Cayce will be remembered as a prophet of someone who continued that work and pushed it forward.
Very good. Mitch, your ideas, your thoughts.
I'll just say briefly, I was struck that the slides that you put up of all the pioneers of the New Age, Madame Blavatsky, Rudolf Steiner, Manly Hall, Edgar Cayce, others among them, are being more widely read today, even discounting for population growth, than they were during their lifetime. It's absolutely extraordinary. Given some of the criticisms that were made of Madame Blavatsky, for example, during her lifetime, you would have had reason to think that she would just be considered some weird Victorian footnote and look what these poor people were into, and yet she's more widely known today, if anything, than she was during her lifetime.
All right, guys, stick around. I want to thank Brian, Kathy, and Mitch. Let's give a hand to this great panel that I had tonight. Amazing. Okay. All right, here we go with some of your questions, folks. Yeah, why don't you go ahead and give it to Valerie? Here we go. What rules or what roles does public education play in maintaining the status quo? I'm not sure if that's the status quo of where we are intellectually, where we are metaphysically. Anybody want to jump in and jump at that one?
I certainly hope not. I think the purpose of education is really to promote, among other things, individual growth, both spiritually, psychologically, and in other ways as well. So the idea that a good education is simply going to maintain the status quo, I think, is a kind of what's the word I'm groping for? It would be a kind of treason against the reason for education. So I would hope not.
Edgar often used the term creative forces to refer to God. Yet the Abrahamic God in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam is rather anthropomorphic. Was Edgar's view of God, not his source's view, but his view of God, more mystical or more conventional? Kathy, I'm going to you first.
I knew you'd come here. In Hebrew theology, there are many names for God. The one we may hear about most is the anthropomorphic type. Jehovah comes to mind. But there were many more names for God in the Old Testament and the Torah. El Shaddai, the magnificent, mighty-breasted one, female people. Elohim. Elohim is a plural form of the creative God, the creator God, and that is the God, the Elohim, is mentioned in Genesis. Adonai, which is, many people have heard of Adonai, I think, maybe not as much as Jehovah, but Adonai is a plural form, my lords. So when you actually delve into, Jewish theology, you will see that God, took many forms, many names, many aspects, and not just the Jehovah, the older, white bearded man that we may popularly think of.
Thank you. Any other comments? Mitch, Brian? All right, let's go on to our next question. This is for Mitch. How do you reconcile the idea that you presented that we are God, the creator, not the created, when the Cayce readings clearly say that God created all souls when he said, "Let there be light"? If we claim we are the first cause, does that give license to do whatever we want without accountability? Basically, a Luciferian hypnotic concept. Hedonistic concept, sorry.
Right. Well, that's a very interesting question. First of all, I do believe in cosmic reciprocity. I do believe in the oneness of all existence. Some people would use the term karma. And that whatever the individual enacts within this sphere of existence is ultimately reciprocal and is coming back to that person. I certainly have a very deeply wrought code of ethics that's come out of years and years of the search. And my primary code is one of nonviolence. I don't mean physical nonviolence per se, or an abstention from self-defense. I mean not doing anything to violate another individual's capacity to live out and to fulfill his or her highest potential. I feel very, very strongly about that. So I drink from many different wells, and I believe very strongly in a commonality, ultimately, of life, and that the individual finds him or herself within a complex that's completely reciprocal. And that's one of the primary places from which my ethics arise.
All right, very good, thank you. Along the question or the topic when we were discussing African American spirituality, what is your opinion, this is for the entire panel, of Martin Luther King and metaphysics? Some question it as it relates to, I'm not sure who this is, James Cone, C-O-N-E. How does peace resistance relate to metaphysics? Brian, let's go to you first.
Well, James Cone was a very famous pioneer of Black theology, which is the idea that you read the Bible and you construct theology through the lens of the Black experience. So he had a kind of, Martin Luther King really had a formative influence on Cone and other Black theologians. And I think the metaphysical part of King's message is the ethical part. He talked about the arc of arc of justice, and if we think of that in metaphysical terms, it's set. The universe does have a kind of justice built into it, and if we work towards it and put ourselves spiritually in line with it, it will be achieved. So I think there is a kind of metaphysical reading of Martin Luther King, although I'm not sure anybody's actually done it explicitly.
All right, go ahead, Mitch.
Yeah, I would just like to add to that there is a family lineage, a family tree of connection between King and theosophy. And I write about this in Occult America, and it's very commonly overlooked by mainstream historians because they just are not looking in the right places. Mahatma Gandhi made statements several times in his letters, interviews, journal articles, that it was Madame H.P. Blavatsky, who he met in London toward the end of her life, who first ignited his own ideal of universal brotherhood. And it was Gandhi who provided King with his first sensibility that the path of nonviolence could be an actual political program, because King, as a young man, was wrestling terribly with the question of how to remain true to his ministerial calling, how to remain true to his Christian pulpit, but also to encourage rebellion. When he's reading from the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, and the meek shall inherit the earth. And he's asking, how do I translate this into a program of radical non-cooperation with a corrupt system? It was Gandhi who provided the bridge. Gandhi provided King with the bridge. And Gandhi credited quite vocally and plainly Madame Blavatsky with first instigating the idea of universal brotherhood. So there's an enormous hole to all this.
Wow, a nexus really between Blavatsky all the way through to King.
It's there.
I didn't raise this in my talk earlier tonight, but thankfully someone else has, so here we go. So what about extraterrestrials? How is that a catalyst for the new awakening? Well, that's an easy one. Brian, I know you have the answer, and then Kathy does too.
Well, I could say the interesting thing is John Fetzer was a true believer in the reality of UFOs. And I think it fit very well with his metaphysical worldview because he just saw the universe is populated with consciousnesses throughout. And it would be very surprising if they didn't engage with humanity. So for a person like John Fetzer, who believed in the reality of extraterrestrials, he really thought they were already engaged in the spiritual evolution of humanity.
Any other comments? Let's move on. We've got a couple more questions, and then we'll let you folks get to your next rounds here. I'm going to put two questions together because I kind of think they fit, and for Mitch and the entire panel. Did Edgar Cayce and Neville Goddard know each other? Did they ever meet? And also, did Cayce ever meet Ernest Holmes? Their teachings use the same vocabulary and teach the same spiritual ideas. Mitch, we'll start with you. Seems like a natural.
I appreciate that question. I've never come upon any evidence that Edgar Cayce and Neville Goddard met, but they were aware of one another to the extent that there is a book up in the library that Neville personally autographed to Edgar Cayce. I'm not aware of Cayce and Ernest Holmes ever having met, but you know, one has to remember Edgar's fame only really began to build in earnest, you know, towards that latter portion of his life, and they were occupying different places geographically. I'm sure that they were aware of one another. I have no question of that. In fact, I'm continually struck at how profoundly Edgar was aware of different people in the spiritual culture, the alternative spiritual culture. Mark Thurston exposed me to the fact that Edgar Cayce recommended the work of the mystic and mathematician P.D. Uspensky, who was a disciple of Gurdjieff's, for parallel study. And I was really surprised and delighted by that. So Edgar's awareness of the world around him was quite vast, but I'm not aware personally of any collaboration or meetings among those figures.
Mitch, you stated that nobody has survived death. Does this not negate the resurrection of Jesus in Cayce's The Pattern and the Savior and the Christ, the power? How can there be reciprocity if there is no eternal life?
Right. Well, I was speaking strictly of physical existence on this particular realm. In fact, when I was making the point in my book, The Miracle Club, that there has been no instance of immortality, I actually turned to a conservative Christian theologian, and I said to him, would I be violating your sense of theology by making this point? And he said, no, you wouldn't, because Christ did undergo physical demise and the resurrection was a spiritual resurrection. So that's my contention in terms of this realm of existence.
Do you think that, I was talking a little bit tonight about, again, evangelical Christianity and the metaphysical root of the nation, and yet we know that there has been some co-opting over the many decades, if not centuries. And I think of Norman Vincent Peale, who I know you've written extensively on, Mitch, and Joel Osteen. You told a very interesting story once about how Norman Vincent Peale, again, talked about the power of positive thinking. And when they asked him what was the root cause of his philosophy, he always talked about Jesus and went to the Bible, as does Joel Osteen. He told me a really interesting story that towards the end of his life, Norman Vincent Peale said, yeah, I kind of did dabble in Ernest Holmes and religious science.
Oh, yeah.
So there's some truth to that.
Yes. Peale was very concerned about making political statements, and he had gotten himself into tremendous controversies for speaking about politics, and his political opinions could run in extreme directions, and he was very cognizant of that later in life and very averse to controversies. But he did talk specifically about receiving influences from Ernest Holmes, from Unity, from Christian Science, and from other branches of the new metaphysics. And I have to hand it to Joel Osteen. People sometimes make fun of him and they feel that he's too milquetoast and what have you. But Joel is one of the very only evangelical ministers who has ever consented to appear on the cover of Guideposts, which is the magazine Norman Vincent Peale founded. And Joel will cite Norman Vincent Peale as a source of influence. And to most evangelicals, Norman Vincent Peale is considered a very squishy, weird figure. He's considered liberal and theologically. He's considered suspect because there is some knowledge and understanding that Peel was drawing upon New Age sources, and Osteen is one of the very few evangelical ministers who will directly cite Peel as an influence, which I think is an act of honesty, and I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. Brian, any comments here before we wrap this up? Anything about, in fact, let me throw this to you because maybe this is a good segue, and then we're really done at this point. Among evangelicals, how big is the movement and how powerful to bring about, let me read this, see if I've got it. Among evangelicals, how big is the movement and how powerful is it to bring about the crisis of the Dome of the Rock war in the Middle East, Armageddon? So let's see if we can bridge the gap there between some evangelical thinking that does borrow from New Thought to something that is much more fundamental and may actually lead us into a crisis.
Well, I know there are voices out there who would like to kind of take a hand in fulfilling prophecy. I just don't know how widespread that is. Quite frankly, personally, I wouldn't be too worried about it. There's an interesting, through the power of prayer, which is a kind of positive thinking, I guess, it kind of shares some of the aspects of New Thought. But as a movement in the United States, I think it's more of a curiosity than it is a real threat.
Mm-hmm. And this final question. Pope Francis says he does not believe in hell. What do you think, Kathleen? What does that tell us, Dr. Callahan, about our future?
I talked about Pope Francis this afternoon. And again, not a Catholic, but I think that this Pope knows a lot that he doesn't say. I think that he's not the only clergy in the Catholic Church or other religions who sometimes have a great deal of knowledge, but they have, for whatever reasons, chosen to work within the framework of conventional religion. I think nothing happens by accident, and Pope Francis is probably here at this time to try as best he can to make inroads in some of the Catholic doctrines. And he's made some changes. He's come out, I don't know that particular statement, but I just think of the story of the young boy who was able, saw him about 7 or 8 years old, and his father had recently died, but his father had come out as being gay, as homosexual before his death. And the boy basically asked Pope Francis, does this mean my father is going to hell? Is he in hell now? And the response of the Pope was not the doctrine of the church. He asked him if he believed that God created his father. And the boy said yes. And the Pope said yes, because God creates all of us. And he says, I believe God loves all his creations. And I think, he can't come out and say some of these things directly because there would be this upheaval, and quite honestly, he would be gone. Okay? Think about what's happened to some previous popes who tried to make changes quickly. So I think he is working to make some changes, and time will tell. I don't know, he's quite elderly, but that's basically what I have to say about Pope Francis.
Well, I'd like to leave you with some information tonight, and you're not going to remember everything that we're going to put up on the screen, but you can find all of these folks one way or the other online. Kevin, if maybe we can plug in here to what I've got. Of course, John Fetzer, The Quest for a New Age is the book that Brian Wilson has just written, and the Fetzer Institute is sharing this and disseminating this through the country, or throughout the country. And you can contact Brian Wilson at Brian C. Wilson, Brian _C Wilson at wmich, mich.edu. You can request a free book. Go to tinyurl.com/Fetzer book. And to learn more, simply go to fetzertrust.org. Dr. Kathy Callahan joining us tonight. She's written a number of books. There are 2 of them on the screen. You can write to her at KALYNKARA@hotmail.com, or simply go to Facebook, Edgar Cayce Oahu. Doesn't that sound lovely? And there you go. Contact author Kathy Callahan and Mitch Horowitz for all things Mitch. It's simple. Go to mitchhorowitz.com. Once again, I'd like to thank Brian Wilson, Dr. Callahan, Mitch Horowitz. Great group tonight. Thank you, folks. Appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Great meeting you both.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate
That
it.
was great. Thank you.
It's fun.
It worked okay. It took me a while to figure out which side to look at. Fantastic. That's great. Well, it's really a lot of fun to participate. Okay. Thank you. Great. Thank you. Bye-bye.